Thanks everybody for coming out to the second session of our three-part series on science and the church, particularly creation and evolution. Because we have a lot of new faces tonight, because tonight's not a rainstorm like it was last week, we're going to do a recap of what we did last week, a short recap, and we're going to again discuss what we are and aren't going to do in these sessions. Session 2 is primarily about Darwin's theory of evolution. That's primarily what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to try to get through a factual explanation of what it is, how it came about, what the responses were to it, and what the continuing responses in the world today are to Darwin's theory of evolution. Extra points if anybody can tell me what those are on the screen. Darwin's finches. All right. Yeah, you guys are with me already. So we'll start by recapping what we did last week. Last week we started out in a very basic way. If we're going to understand the relationship between science and the church, we first have to understand some very basic things about science and what science seeks to do and what the church believes about the scientific endeavor. So, Catholics believe in the laws of nature. This is opposed to some other types of religious belief. We talked about those. These can be called pantheism, perpetual creationism, or occasionalism. Pantheism is the idea that God is in everything, that God is in the plants and the trees, and the plants and the trees are God. And if that's the case, then the plants, the trees, and the animals are not going to follow natural laws because they are God. Perpetual creation is the idea that God constantly recreates the entire universe in each instant. And if you think that you understand how something works, you're wrong, because actually it's just God's decision to keep doing things in a certain way when He chooses. There are no natural laws. Occasionalism is a similar theology which says that God specifically wills every single thing that happens. We as Catholics don't believe any of these things. We believe that the universe is allowed by God to run according to the laws of nature. God allows His creation to run according to natural laws the vast majority of the time. We talked about how repeatable laws of nature are the basis of science, that science is the study of the natural, not the supernatural. Nature is repeatable and predictable. If something's not repeatable and predictable, then you can't come to understand its laws and you can't make predictions about it. Science seeks to understand the natural world, to test these understandings with predictions. That can only happen in nature. You can't use science on the supernatural. Christ taught this understanding of the world in Scripture. We talked about a couple of specific teachings. We talked about the blind man in John 9, the apostles using a very understandable, ancient Jewish idea of the running of the world, asked Christ, why is the blind man blind? Is it because of his own sin, because of his parents' sin? And Christ said, neither one. We also talked about the falling over of the tower at Siloam. This was a disaster that happened. The tower fell over and killed people in Jerusalem. And Christ, when He was asked why it happened, He said, it's not because those people were more evil than anybody else. In other words, the natural events are not God's vengeance being visited upon the world. This understanding of the laws of nature being separate from the active will of God helps to purify religion from superstition. We're Catholics. We're interested in religion, not superstition. We're the ones that go in and chop down the fairy tree. You know that story of St. Boniface? St. Boniface was the missionary to the pagan peoples in Germany. And he went into the village where they had the oak tree. It's variously known as the fairy tree or Thor's oak or Jove's oak. And so here's the Catholic missionary coming into the pagan town where they say, oh, well, this is our magic tree. And what does the Catholic missionary do? He takes an axe and he chops down the magic tree. Because the Catholic is the one in the room working to dispel superstition and to lobby in favor of an understandable world, not a magical world. We Catholics are supposed to be the ones lobbying for an understandable world, not a magic world full of fairies and sprites. So we used a concrete example of how science purifies religion from superstition. We put up our track of hurricanes, and we talked about how we Catholics do a pretty darn good job of understanding the world runs according to natural laws, and that most people in the United States do a pretty good job of this until a hurricane strikes somewhere, and then we all come under this temptation. Even Catholics come under the temptation to say, well, I think that the hurricane hit New Orleans, because they're immoral down there. Or I think the hurricane hit Florida because it's God smiting them. And we, in order to dispel superstition, we use science in a very small way, put up our map of hurricane tracks and said, now please tell us which one of these cities God hates the most. Okay, we decided that God loves Las Vegas because Las Vegas never had a hurricane. Well, right on cue, since last week, there has been a natural disaster. Of course, a horrible typhoon hit the Philippines. There's been great loss of life, property, a lot of suffering. And just to prove the point, it took about 30 seconds of Googling to find a tremendous number of people on the internet who were blaming this on the people of the Philippines, that they were immoral, particularly blaming it on recent political decisions in the Philippines. And I even found, much to my dismay, some Catholics on some Catholic discussion boards that were saying, oh, definitely, God hates the people of the Philippines. That deserves a facepalm there. Nope. We are the ones trying to dispel superstition. As Christ would say, do you think that those people in the Philippines are more sinful than you? No. As Catholics, we cling to this understanding of a natural world because this allows us to understand the workings of the world in a way that doesn't make us superstitious and doesn't compel us to believe untrue things about God. So we went through this last week. Does that make sense to everyone? All right? We went over the Galileo story in detail. We're going to go over it in 2 seconds tonight. We talked about it being a revolution. This was a revolution from one worldview, which was an ancient Greek worldview, which was built on perfection, a clockwork universe where all the planets went around the Earth in perfect circles, suspended on crystal spheres, this sort of a thing. It was a geometrically perfect and miraculous world. Galileo ushered in, he and Kepler and other astronomers ushered in an age that was true. It fit the observations. It was a better description of the universe, but it was a more imperfect universe. Planets no longer went in perfect circles. They went in ugly egg-shaped ovals. The Earth was no longer at the center. Instead, the sun was at the center. This is our modern understanding. This is a better explanation of what we see in the universe, but it was a big shift of worldview. Galileo was a hasty man, and he demanded that the people around him, particularly being in Italy, he demanded that the Catholic Church move right now to accept this new worldview. It took Catholics a long time to catch up. Galileo may have been a little bit unreasonable in demanding that everyone come over to this new way of thinking, mostly because of his assurances. However, certainly it was a very ugly incident when authorities of the Church persecuted and locked up a scientist who turned out in the end to be right. And of course, this is why John Paul II apologized for this, and I, for one, am glad John Paul did. Through this very ugly incident, we arrive at the modern relationship between the church and science, which is independence and caution. The church understands that science is an independent endeavor and that science produces truth. But the church also urges caution because the church understands that science is an ongoing process. So the church says we're going to let science be independent and respect this independence, but we're also going to be cautious of how we apply these discoveries to our understanding of the world. The church also began to teach very strongly in the wake of the Galileo incident that faith and reason, you can also interpret that as science and the church, are never truly in contradiction. If you think that the world discovered by science and the world described by faith are in contradiction, the church says, well, then you have one of them wrong because they can't actually contradict. Does that make sense to everyone? We're going through this really fast, so I appreciate you guys keeping up. That's great. We also went over the first of our explanations of origins. We talked about young earth and old earth creationism. We stressed that because these do not touch on, nor do they deny any dogmas of the faith, that even if you don't agree with someone that holds these beliefs, you can't call them, and certainly should never call that person a heretic, just as they should never call anybody else a heretic if we're disagreeing about explanations of origins, because we're not talking about things that touch on dogmas of the faith. This gets bandied about from time to time. Somebody will call somebody else a heretic because they disagree on this point. That would be incorrect. If you are denying the divinity of Christ, then yes, somebody should call you a heretic. That's technically correct. This is not a matter of heresy. However, these origin explanations present challenges to Catholics. What we'll find out over the course of this is that all origin explanations present challenges to Catholics. The particular challenges presented by these explanations, young earth creationism and old earth creationism, is They apparently put faith in opposition to reason, which is something the church said you don't have to do. And secondly, they attempt to read the book of Genesis in a way that the church does not encourage us to do. Now, to make this very clear, the reason to be interested in creationism, strict 6 days, a literal interpretation of Genesis, the reason to be interested in this is if you are attempting to maintain a completely literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. And as we talked about last week, and we'll talk about some more this week, that's not something the church encourages us to do. And we went over last week, and we'll go over again multiple statements by the church, by councils and by popes, where we're not encouraged to maintain against reason a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. What we're going to do tonight, we're going to investigate the Darwinian revolution. I'm calling it a revolution to draw this parallel with Galileo and Kepler. We're going to investigate the response of the Catholic Church. We're going to investigate the response of American Protestant culture. We're going to explain what evolution is and means. We're going to explain common descent, one of the key points of Darwin's theory. We're going to investigate proofs of common descent. We're going to do it very, very quickly because this takes us a lot of information to get through. What we're not going to do, we're not going to debate creation versus evolution in this room. If you want to have a great rip-snorting debate about it, it's available on the internet 24/7, 365. I've been in there many times myself. If you want to be really frustrated, go on and go in and have fun debating. And again, we're not going to brand anyone a heretic over this topic. We're not talking about dogmas of the faith. And again, I like Calvin cartoons, so I'll try to throw at least one in. All right, so just like last week, we set up what the worldview, the common worldview was before the Galilean Keplerian revolution. We're also going to set up what the common worldview was before Darwin's revolution. And this, it's tough to find a set of terms that really describes this, but I think the best one is natural theology. The idea that the world exists precisely as created and is created by God's active will, so you can learn a tremendous amount about the Creator by looking at the created world. This natural theology was very popular in the Victorian era, and one of the lights of natural theology was William Paley, who wrote at the beginning of the 19th century in England, and his argument has gone down in history as the watchmaker argument. And so if you ever hear about the watchmaker argument, this is William Paley. And you find this argument comes up again and again and again. We're going to be talking about intelligent design later on, and that is going to harken back to the watchmaker argument. So Paley basically says, if I found a watch on the ground and I observed that it had all of these parts that all work together, then would I presume that it had formed by natural random processes, or would I presume that a watchmaker, somebody that understood how watches work, had built it to be a watch? And so this is the watchmaker argument, and this is particularly when Darwin publishes his book, The Origin of Species, this is particularly what's being challenged, because Darwin is going to say plants and animals are not perfectly designed machines, each one designed perfectly for its job. This is a new understanding. These revolutions are, I think they can be described in parallel. The revolution about the planets and the stars, what happened there is that the idea that the universe was a perfect clockwork magical universe had become merged and conflated with Christianity. As we talked about last week, that's not true. That's not actually a dogma of the Catholic faith, that the universe is a perfect clockwork universe with all the planets moving on crystal spheres. But it was something that people had naturally fallen into. Common sense observations had lulled people into this idea, so that when Galileo came to them and said, well, the world's actually rotating at thousands of miles an hour and flying through space, and he didn't yet have the theory of gravitation to explain how it all worked, somebody could commonsensically say, then why don't we fly off? And Galileo didn't really have a consistent answer, and they sent him away to house arrest. In the same way, the Darwinian revolution, before all of the science is filled in, it's a commonsensical objection to say, well, all of these animals and plants appear perfectly suited to do their jobs. why would I not believe they were specifically created for these purposes? It's a commonsensical objection. But in the same way that the commonsensical objection to the sun to the earth moving around the sun eventually fell to science, I think we can see that over time, Paley's idea will also fall under the weight of the scientific investigation. So, did Catholics need the planets to move in perfect circles? No. No, obviously. None of us care about that. None of our neighbors care about that. Probably nobody in the city of Tyler really cares, about the shift in worldview from geocentrism to heliocentrism. Do Catholics need each species of plant and animal to be perfectly designed? Well, no, the church says no. But of course, we do have friends and neighbors in Tyler that are very, very concerned about that. They're concerned about it in school boards, textbooks, universities, all kinds of places. So, we'll talk about how this happened. We talked about Galileo last time. We'll talk about Charles Darwin a little tiny bit. So, Charles Darwin is a man of the 19th century, which means that he's a Victorian naturalist, a Renaissance man. He was mostly a geologist, somewhat a paleontologist, somewhat a biologist. This is the way things were in the 19th century. Scholars were not as specialized. The formative event in Darwin's life is he's able to take a voyage on a Royal Navy survey ship called the Beagle that goes all around the world, most notably all around South America and to all of the islands around South America. When he leaves on this voyage on the Beagle for 5 years, you notice he's a very young man, because you had to be young and vigorous to spend 5 years aboard ship in those days. A lot of people died on board ship. When he leaves as a young man, he actually had considered becoming a clergyman in the Anglican Church, and he is a pretty strict creationist when he leaves. He comes back in 1836 having seen the animals and plants all around the world and made a tremendous number of observations. He was very bright and insightful. He comes back. The presentation of his scientific information he's gathered on the voyage of the Beagle instantly makes him a well-respected scientist. The publication of the journals that he wrote instantly made him a well-respected and liked popular author. This is a very capable man. Only a year later, he's already writing in his private notebooks the elements of the theory of evolution. It's not published for 22 more years. Now, if you remember, the problem that Galileo particularly had with the authority structure of the day is that he jumped the gun. He knew this was right, he knew it was true, but all the proofs were not lined up, all of the science was not done. Darwin, who knows, maybe he was specifically thinking of Galileo part of the time. Darwin spent 22 years organizing his theory of biological evolution. By the time he actually got around to publishing The Origin of Species, here it is, you can buy it, I recommend it. By the time he got around to publishing it, he had spent 22 years anticipating objections to the theory and filling in the gaps as best he could. It was very, very solid on the day that it was published. Now, I think this is something good. This is a service for mankind that a scientist does when he doesn't jump the gun. Darwin didn't jump the gun. He was going to wait longer, but he received a letter from a colleague named Wallace who was describing a similar theory, and Darwin says, well, I've got to go now or I'm going to be scooped. So he publishes 22 years that were spent refining the theory. That was time well spent. It was solid, and it was real science from the day that it was published. What were the reactions to the book? Well, the first review was published from an advance copy even before the book was available to the public. And I'm sure Darwin, being a scientist, wanted a scientific review of the book. He didn't get it. The very first one was a theological review of the book, which said, one of the quotes is, "Why construct an elaborate theorem to exclude God from acts of creation?" This sets the tone for the next 150 years. Right from the beginning, it becomes a theological question. Now, in The Origin of Species, Darwin talks about the struggle for existence, particularly between animals, between predators and prey, the competition between animals. Okay, we're all from Texas and we know about deer hunting, so the competition between animals doesn't surprise us. If you ever sat in a deer stand, you've watched the competition between animals. This is not a big deal for Texans. So one of the most outrageous things that was said about the book within a few years of it being published, so David Livingstone was the famous missionary to Africa. You know, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, is a famous quote about him. So he had spent decades of his life in Africa, and he read Darwin's book about the struggle for existence, and he didn't like it, and he said, I don't see any struggle for existence on the African plains. Well, I have the Discovery Channel. I see a struggle for existence on the African plains all the time. If you ever watch PBS, you know about the struggle for existence on the African plains. I think this is an indicator of how politically and theologically charged this was right from the beginning. For somebody who had been in Africa for a long time to write home to people who had never seen it and said, there's not really a struggle for existence here. I put 4!5 there for a reason. And of course, while I'm sure Darwin wanted the most enthusiastic response to his book to be from scientists, predictably, and in a foreshadowing of the next 150 years, the most enthusiastic response was from atheists. And there was tremendous vitriol on all sides of this. And so I've included a little cartoon there. This is common of what you would see in anti-Darwin newspapers in Great Britain at the time. The idea that Darwin thought he was a monkey or that his grandfather was a monkey, these ideas were everywhere. What was the reaction among Catholics? Now, I want you to contrast this in your mind. We talked about last week. It took the church at least 200 years to catch up with Galileo. Now, that wasn't all a mistake because Galileo and Kepler's ideas didn't really make consistent scientific sense until Newton formulated the theory of universal gravitation. Then it started to make sense. So within 150 or so years after it starts to make consistent sense, you see Catholics have caught up with this, and the hierarchy is behind heliocentrism, and it's been a long time, been 400 years, it's no longer, no one cares about it anymore. You know, I bring it up, but only as a demonstration. What happened after the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859? Well, the first notable response from a Catholic that I could find was 1868, Cardinal Newman. If you don't know who Cardinal Newman is, you've got to find out about Cardinal John Henry Newman. He's one of the most famous converts to the Catholic Church of all time. He converted from the Anglican Church to the Roman Catholic Church. His great book is on the development of Christian doctrine. It's heavy lifting to read it, but it's so awesome, I still recommend it. And he said, I do not see that the accidental evolution of organic beings is inconsistent with divine design. It is accidental to us, not to God. This is probably the first statement ever by a Catholic of something called theistic evolution, the idea that evolution that is somehow part of God's plan is completely okay and understandable for a Catholic. It's actually a very sophisticated statement. That's in 1868. That's 9 years. We already have very, very visible members of the Catholic Church saying, I don't see any problem with this within 9 years. 1893, we talked about Providentissimus Deus, the encyclical of Leo XIII. It's particularly on the topic of reading Scripture in a modern scientific age. And we remember from last week, he reiterates this principle that comes to us all the way from St. Augustine in the 4th century that says, the beginning of Genesis is poetry. We know that it's poetry. It's not meant to be a literal scientific account. It's not even internally consistent in that way. It's formulated as poetry. In 1894, the Holy Office, now this is the big bad Holy Office of the Inquisition, the bad guys, right? The ones that are responsible for all the censorship. Well, we Catholics have a little different view of that than most people. This was the office in the Vatican that was charged with regulating publications and suppressing publications that were theologically incorrect, you know, things that had heresy in them. Well, in 1894, it's neat. There's a new book called Negotiating Darwin, which I recommend, which is the proceedings of the Holy Office in the late 19th and early 20th century concerning evolution, because Catholics, particularly Jesuit scientists, priests, were writing books about evolution, and they were all going to the Holy Office to see whether they were fit to be published. And there was a lot of debate going on in the Holy Office at the time. None of the debate concerned the evolution of plants and animals. Nobody in the Holy Office of the Inquisition had any problem with the evolution of plants and animals. Nobody cared. They did have questions concerning what Catholics were to believe concerning the evolution of human beings, and there was a debate going on inside the Holy Office. That's what the book Negotiating Darwin's about. I recommend it. It's pretty awesome. In 1894, they did reject a book on the basis that it taught a particular type of human evolution called special transformism, because they said, we don't know if this is okay for Catholics. In 1909, if you want to find the most anti-evolution statement that has ever come out of the Vatican since the publication of Darwin's book, you can find it here. There was a decree from the Pontifical Biblical Council in 1909 And this was the Pontifical Biblical Commission, that was the Pope's special commission on the Scriptures, and that was, of all the groups of people working in the Vatican, that was probably the most anti-evolution group, and they said as many anti-evolution things as they could in their decree, but even in that one, they're only limiting this belief in special creation to mankind. Again, no problems with the evolution of plants and animals. 1950, we now have an encyclical from Pope Pius XII specifically about evolution. Pope Pius XII, not a liberal. Pope Pius XII, you may have seen, he liked to wear the little tiny round glasses, and there's a great statue of him in St. Peter's wearing the little tiny round glasses where he looks, really, really commanding and really harsh. So Pope Pius XII, he was the Pope during World War II, and if you know the stories of some of the things the church had to do as far as hiding Jews in Rome, things like that, if you ever watched The Scarlet and the Black, that great movie, that was Pius XII, that was all his work. He was a tough guy. It's well known he was not a fan of evolution. He wasn't personally a fan of it. I think it's pretty well established that Pius XII kind of hoped it was a fad. He really hoped that scientists would find some other way to understand this. But even though he didn't personally like it very much, being a Pope of the Catholic Church, we can look at the wisdom with which he teaches the Church about it. The only objections that he raises to biological evolution concern human evolution. He says it's allowable for Catholics to investigate plant and animal evolution, and it's allowable to investigate human evolution provided, and he puts these stipulations, and he says, provided that nothing that you teach violates our dogmatic beliefs in original sin and the soul. Now, later on, we'll talk about the details of those things that Pius said about it, because those are still relevant today, because there hasn't been another encyclical since then about evolution. This encyclical in 1950 was extremely modern and forward-looking, and the Church has not felt the need to update it up to this point with any other papal teaching, official papal teaching on the subject. Now, John Paul II in 1996 makes an unofficial teaching. He makes a speech, but he goes even farther and says, well, there's no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith regarding man and his vocation. And then he goes on to say, provided the supernatural nature of the soul is respected. In other words, don't become an atheist. Don't disbelieve that you have a soul. Don't start believing that because you might be descended from previous life forms, don't start thinking that you're just an animal, essentially. Don't start thinking that you're not a special creation of God and that you have an immortal soul with an eternal destiny. Can we see the difference between how the Catholic Church reacts to Darwin with how it reacted to Galileo? Did the Church learn? Oh, yes, a tremendous amount. What happened in North America? Because as we North Americans are aware, we don't live in a Catholic country. We live in a Christian nation, but of course our nation was settled primarily by English Protestants, and then Dutch Protestants and different Protestants, and we live in a Protestant world. So the reaction to Darwinism that happened in North America is the reaction primarily of Protestantism. In the late 1800s, Protestantism in the United States was divided. It was divided between liberal Protestantism on the East Coast, and then out where we live here in the South, there was a more conservative Protestantism. Particularly, there was a theology that was gaining ground called Princeton theology. It's named after Princeton Theological Seminary. This is important, so listen. It's the idea that the Bible is completely and totally inerrant because it was dictated directly from the mouth of God to the ears of men. That it's the Word of God in a very, very, very literal way. That there cannot be any poetry, there cannot be any ambiguity. It all has to be literally true, because this is the understanding of inspiration that came out of the Princeton Theological Seminary. Now, what will be of interest to us in Tyler, Texas, is that a few years later, this fad kind of passed through Princeton Theological Seminary, but it took deep root at another institution, Dallas Theological Seminary. Many, many, many of your friends and neighbors have pastors who were either educated at, or more likely were educated deeply in the tradition of Dallas Theological Seminary, which is this Princeton theology, the idea that every word of the Bible is equally and literally true, because it was dictated directly from God. So we have this is set up. We're in this part of the country where this wing of Protestantism is flourishing, particularly in the Baptist Church. In 1910, a break happens between liberal Protestantism on the East Coast and conservative Protestantism here where we are, with the publication of a book, a series of books called The Fundamentals. These came out of Los Angeles. This is an attempt by conservative Protestants to reiterate what real Protestantism is. So it's a list of fundamentals, and it's very anti-evolution, and it is, of course, the Princeton theology, the idea that every single word of the Bible is completely, literally inerrant. And at the beginning of this, the people that are using this as a formative text refer to themselves as fundamentalists. Now, later on, they would stop referring to themselves as fundamentalists, and this would become a pejorative that other people assign to them. But this is where fundamentalism comes from. This is what fundamentalism is, and it took deep, deep root in the Baptist Church in the southern United States. One of the most famous fundamentalists of all time was a politician from Nebraska, three-time losing presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was a famous politician, author, lawyer, and he, not because he had any scientific objections to Darwinism, but because he had social objections to it. He thought that Darwinism was responsible for starting World War I because he thought that it had convinced Germans that they were a superior species of people. You can see that's going to be a common idea. And also because he thought that Darwinism was a cause of the loss of faith and atheism among college students. Well, we'll talk about that some more too. He started an official campaign against Darwinism. So in 1925, the city of Dayton, Tennessee, which didn't have anything to bring tourists to it, had nothing special, decided they were going to put themselves on the map by creating a show trial around evolution. Has anybody ever seen the movie Inherit the Wind? Inherit the Wind is a fictionalized account of the Scopes trial. Scopes was the name of the public school science teacher that they put on trial for teaching evolution, which was against state law. Tennessee actually had a law. William Jennings Bryan, and part of his campaign against Darwinism was to have state laws passed against teaching evolution in schools. And so they needed somebody to stand trial, so Scopes kind of volunteered. He later said, I don't know if I taught evolution or not, but they wanted to have a trial, so I volunteered. So they put him on the stand, and the two greatest lawyers came in to try the case. You had William Jennings Bryan for the prosecution, and you had Clarence Darrow for the defense, and they had a big show trial. They even had trained chimpanzees that would perform on the front lawn of the courthouse. It was a big time. They eventually convicted Scopes, but they overturned it on a conviction. He was fined $100. Nothing in Dayton really happened because of this. But one of the great newspaper reporters of all time, H.L. Mencken, covered the trial for East Coast newspapers. And this was the beginning of this stereotype. Mencken cast William Jennings Bryan as an ignorant, anti-science, anti-reason fundamentalist out to destroy reason, science, and progress. Millions of people read the accounts of the trial as it was going on in Mencken's words, and Mencken was trying to tear down Bryan. And this is where you have, now I think you can start, this will start to all be recognizable to you. This is where you get the beginnings of a northeastern United States stereotype that people in the South are ignorant, anti-science fundamentalists. Is that sort of familiar to you? Well, this comes mostly out of the Scopes trial, out of Mencken's work. This is polarizing the nation along these lines. Since 1925 until now, there has been a never-ending series of court cases in which citizens and school boards and state legislatures across the South, in a continuation of William Jennings Bryan's campaign against Darwinism, have attempted to enforce standards on textbooks for science classrooms. And of course, it's still going on. We're having one of those right now in Texas. You can pick up the newspaper and you can read about this going on today in Texas concerning what our school textbooks are going to say about Darwinian evolution. This started back in the 20s and it's never stopped. And of course, when you have there have been court cases all around the country, and the sides haven't changed much. The arguments haven't changed much. These court cases, PBS, the show Nova, did a special on one of these trials. I believe it was the Dover case. It's really fascinating to watch because they interviewed all the participants, and the two expert witnesses, one for the side that was in favor of teaching only Darwinism as the settled science of the day in the classrooms, and the other expert witness that was in favor of not teaching strictly Darwinism, but of teaching variation, intelligent design, theistic evolution. Both the expert witnesses were Catholic scientists. It's really interesting. It was a really good example of how a Catholic could, from a religious standpoint, hold a variety of views. That when they went to go find the best people to articulate these standpoints, they went and got two Catholics. Of course, neither one was arguing for fundamentalism. Anyway, so I want to talk about a real-world example, just because it's from my life. I enjoy it. So, in the 1940s, my dad was being educated here on the Red River in Munster, which is a town which was settled by German Catholic immigrants, and they had a parochial school, and the parochial school was staffed by nuns from Switzerland, very well-educated ladies. This is in the 1940s, and he was taught in science class Darwinian evolution, a fairly strict form of Darwinian evolution, and following the pronouncements of the church that there was no conflict in the evolution of plants and animals and God's providence. This is what they taught. My dad went on to become a scientist, became a geologist, and he used the geologic column, the fossil record, in his work every day, and has never had a problem with it as a Catholic. He just turned 81, and he still goes to Mass every day and believes in Darwinian evolution and used the fossil record all during his career. This is the sort of consistent understanding that he came out of Catholic school with. Now, so almost 40 years later, I'm educated here in Houston, which is not founded by Catholics. We like to say about Houston, that's where there's more Baptists than people. So I went to a Baptist school, and you think, wow, you're 40 years later. What more did you learn than your father? What advancements? No, I learned a lot less. I was taught the Princeton theology. I was taught biblical inerrancy, and we weren't allowed to be taught anything in our science classes which would violate that Princeton theology. So I learned a lot less science during my education than my dad did, even though I was, 40 years later, just by virtue of the politics of where we grew up. So I have some pretty strong opinions about these textbook fights because I wish I'd had a real textbook when I was a kid. Anyway, so that's sort of how this plays out in the real world, how it has played out in Texas. So, evolution is controversial in the United States. If you, here's my graph here of all of these different countries and a popular poll of belief in evolution of species, evolution of animals and plants. And you can see that here you have Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, some of the most atheistic nations in the world. And the most atheistic nation currently is Belgium. It's up here at 70%. And then the United States is down here next to last. Only Turkey, among the polled nations, only Turkey has fewer people in it that believe in the evolution of species. Now, a lot of people, a lot of scientists, when they look at this, they hang their head in shame because they say, well, this is obviously a big problem. What should we as Catholics think about that? I'd like you to keep that question in your mind as we proceed through this. What should Catholics think about that graph? Where do we find ourselves in 2013? Richard Dawkins is the most famous proponent of evolution on the planet today. He's an evolutionary biologist who has become a pop author and a spokesman for atheism. He's not a nice man, but he's a smart man. And this is, I tried to find a quotation that encapsulated what he says about religion, because a lot of people, a tremendous number of people, listen to Richard Dawkins on this topic. And he says, I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. Is that an accurate description of Catholicism? I would say definitely not. It's not an accurate description of the Catholicism that our popes are trying to lead us into. That's a description of the religion that the pagans were practicing when they said the fairies live in the tree. That's not the religion of St. Boniface, who chopped down the tree and said, the tree is just a tree, God is in heaven. Dawkins has lumped us in with fundamentalism. And this is why I think this particular topic is important to us. We're being lumped in with fundamentalism when we as Catholics have tried so hard not to be lumped in with fundamentalism. We try to produce scientists. We have the Jesuits. As much trouble as the Jesuits caused, the Jesuits are awesome because the Jesuits have always been the scientific arm of the church. And we produce, as a church, we produce people who are honest intellectuals. We produce scientists. We produce teachers. We produced, even in the 1920s and 30s, we were producing nuns who were self-sacrificial enough to give up any ideas they had about their own life and go and teach other Catholics for free. By the way, just an aside, what's the greatest engine of social mobility ever invented in the history of the world is Catholic education. The idea that you take your best and brightest young people and you encourage them to completely freely give their intellectual gifts back as education for the next generation. And if you do that enough times, Catholics go from being the poorest of the poor and the most ignorant to being the most educated and some of the wealthiest with the best health and the best everything. It's just an interesting thing. That's how Catholic education is meant to work. And it's not meant to work on superstition. So I think this is worth thinking about because we still have Catholics, we still have young Catholics that when they're in high school biology or they go off to university, if they haven't been presented with the church's understanding of the relationship of the church to science and of the natural world, then they get into a class for the first time and somebody snipes their understanding and they say, oh, you're religious, you're a Christian? Well, how can you possibly be a Christian? Do you think that all of the animals and plants, all of the millions of species on every continent around the world are all descended from those animals that walked out of the ark at the end of the flood on Mount Ararat? And the young Catholic person says, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. That doesn't stand up to even 30 seconds of scrutiny. Of course I don't believe that. And if they haven't been well catechized, they don't understand these things, they say, maybe it's all a lie. Maybe my religion makes no sense. I know I certainly felt that way about Christianity. That's among my peer group, that was a very common experience. We particularly, now looking back on our college experience, we recognize which of those professors took the freshman classes, not because they enjoyed freshmen, not because those were the stimulating classes to teach, but the ones who were eager to be apostles for atheism, and they wanted the mushiest young minds to go after. I remember my professors that were like that. I know my wife, and I've talked about this. She remembers her professors. Our friends and peers remember those professors that were laying in wait for us, those of us that were not well instructed, not well catechized, and didn't understand all of this. And they were just waiting to tell us that our faith was foolish. So this is another reason why this is important. All right, now we'll get to the meat of this. We'll get to the facts of this. Defining evolution. If you look up evolution, the dictionary definition, you can find all sorts of photographs like this that show a sequence and a progression. We're not talking about that. We're talking specifically about biology. The theory of evolution, the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the earth. Okay? When we say theory, we've got to stop there because theory is an abused and misunderstood word. If I had $1 for every time I had discussed this topic and somebody said, well, it's only a theory. A theory is just an idea. A theory is just a guess. If I had $1 for every time, I'd be wearing a much nicer suit. A scientific theory is not a guess. A scientific theory is an explanation of some aspect of the natural world that has been substantiated through repeated experiments or testing. You know who understood that concept really, really well? Pope John Paul II. Because Pope John Paul II talked about evolution, he used the terms properly. He said, new knowledge has led to the recognition of the theory of evolution as more than a hypothesis. It is indeed remarkable that this theory has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge. The convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, that means it's not a conspiracy against Christians. The convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, of the results of work that was conducted independently is in itself a significant argument in favor of this theory. That's the Pope. Pope John Paul was a brilliant, brilliant man, a philosopher that understood science very, very well. If you want to read good Catholic thought on evolution, read what John Paul wrote about it. It's fantastic. What were Darwin's insights? What's so radical about this? Well, we'll clump them together in three. Common descent, natural selection, and the origin and multiplication of species. Here in the corner of the slide, I've reproduced the scribble, the original scribble of the Tree of Life from Darwin's notebook, where Darwin is working out how he thinks this process worked out, that there was one original ancestor. You can see the number 1 there at the bottom. And that life forms a tree-shaped branching as different forms develop. Darwin's theory wasn't complete. It didn't have total descriptive power until the contribution of genetics came. And the beginning of genetics, the man that's called the father of modern genetics, is Gregor Mendel. And we're going to talk about him a little bit because he's Catholic. He's an Augustinian monk. His name was Johann, but when a monk takes perpetual vows, they give him a new name, and his monk name was Gregor. So he was an Augustinian, and he was not the first person to try to understand genetic inheritance, but the other studies that had been done before, the criticism of them you find is that they were too short term. Somebody would take a species and they would breed it for a few life cycles. They didn't have time for it. Nobody would commit to really long-term studies. He was a monk. Monks are very, very patient people. They have nothing to do but pray and do long-term projects. So, he studies pea plants. Pea plants have a rapid life cycle, and he develops the laws of inheritance. This is the beginning of modern genetics. Then eventually, almost 100 years later, there's the discovery of the chemical components of inheritance, the DNA molecule, and the understanding of how that works specifically. But it starts with Mendel. And this provides the engine, this is the engine of Darwin's theory. Because when Darwin's talking about this tree, there's not a thing there to understand what it is that's changing. If he's saying, well, these species can change before the understanding of genetics, particularly before the chemical composition of DNA, you're talking about things in a more philosophical way. And you can say, well, the lion has lionness. And the dog has dogness, you know, and the cat has catness, but these things can change. But once you have this modern understanding that this lionness or this dogness or birdness is information, now you have something that can change. Information can change. Anybody that's ever tried to copy something, copy a long article and type it out, knows that information can change. So, we'll talk about common descent, one of Darwin's central ideas. And this is what I think for a Catholic, to distinguish Catholicism from fundamentalism, this is it right here. This is the centrality of it. We can talk, later we'll talk about the mechanism by which this happens. Natural selection is how Darwin described it. That's good. We'll get to that. That's important. But this here is the meat, because this is what distinguishes Catholicism, which is a faith which is able to be in harmony with our observations of the natural world. This is what's important. Every species is related. Every species has a position on the tree. Every species has a common ancestor. This is a really important point because it means that life began on Earth only once. The tree has one trunk. This is something it's a fascinating discovery of the scientific endeavor, that life has begun on Earth only once. Good to think about that for a minute. There are probably some theological implications we'll get to in the next class period about life beginning on Earth only once. That common ancestor, that first organism, lived a very long time ago because these processes that we're talking about are slow. We won't have a new species develop in this room during this class period. Oh, we don't know what the bugs in the walls are doing. There could be speciation occurring, but it won't happen over this hour and a half. The processes are slower than that. Groups of species branched away from each other during this history. The branching of the tree is a real thing. Similar species branched away from each other more recently. If I and yeast are living things on the tree of life, then we are farther away on the tree of life than me and a dog, which is more similar to me. That seems fairly obvious. So here's a simplified representation of the tree. I've left off most of the tree because most of the tree goes way out over here and it's microorganisms that most of us have never heard of. I know you've heard of them, but the rest of us haven't. This is the part of the tree dealing with plants and animals. For a non-scientist, it's pretty fascinating to look at the entire tree and see what a tiny, tiny part plants and animals are. But what you see here is you can see divisions into, well, particularly you see divisions around traits. This is an important concept because it says that if a trait developed for one part of the tree, then you won't see that trait popping up somewhere else in the tree. Animals divided, and then long after animals are dividing into arthropods and other types of animals, then jawbones develop much, much later on. Well, it's a proof of common descent that we don't happen to see any millipedes with jawbones. Jawbones are over on a different part of the tree. They developed in a different place, at a different time, in a different line of animals. These traits that are only common to these groups that share a common descent is an important proof that the tree concept is logical, that it works, that it's a true representation of life. We won't find any mollusk with feathers. Now, just to point out, if there are no rules to this, if every form of life is specially created and there are no rules, then you could find anything with feathers. Life doesn't work that way in our observation. Our observations of the tree support common descent. The fossil record is an important proof of common descent. So now we need to stop and talk about the fossil record, because this is also something that's very extensively misunderstood in the United States for reasons that we've talked about. Common descent will predict. We talked about how science seeks to prove its understandings by making predictions. So what does common descent say? Common descent says that the fossil record will show simpler forms of life in the oldest strata, in the oldest rocks. Those fossils will be of simpler forms. There will be more forms and more complex forms as you move up. What would a failure of the Darwinian model be? Well, the Cambrian was 500 million years ago, and you only expect to find sea cucumbers and anemones in the Cambrian. If you found a rabbit, that would be a problem. We've never found a rabbit in any rocks from the Cambrian. We instead find anemones and sea cucumbers, sea slugs, things like that. We find the rabbits in the much younger strata. The fossil record is consistent with this. It's consistent with this idea. Just to pile on one more time, this is not consistent with the idea, which you hear from time to time, that all the rocks, all the sedimentary rocks were laid down in the great flood that carries Noah's Ark. If there was a great flood and everything was churned up, you wouldn't have things organized by age. It's a very simple proof of that, but people skip it all the time. If you want to know about the fossil record, you have to keep up with modern research. Science is an ongoing thing. One of the things that you will hear all the time in this debate is, well, there are no transitional forms. There's all missing links. The fossil record's completely incomplete, and it's all missing links. That's very, very old information. Back when Darwin wrote The Origin in the 1850s, he complains in this book. He says, our fossil record is very incomplete. So people that want to disprove Darwin go to this book and they say, aha, the fossil record is very incomplete. Okay, this is 1859. A lot of people have been working on this for a very long time. The number of fossil species that have been discovered between 1859 and now is in the hundreds of thousands of identified fossil species. And paleontologists will tell you there's probably that many again sitting in drawers waiting for somebody to have the time to take them out, clean them off, and catalog them. This is not an incomplete record. I'm going to use an example here, and I'm going to show you how modern paleontology actually works. So we'll go back to my slide here. This is actually the sequence from lobe-finned fish to amphibians. This is what I have here, and right in the middle there, that's my favorite little guy, Tiktaalik. How was Tiktaalik discovered? This is a great story. There's a nice book about it. I recommend it, by Neil Shubin. If you know that there are lobe-finned fish living in freshwater 390 million years ago, and you suspect that they're the direct ancestors of amphibians that walked on land, and you know that by 360 million years ago there are amphibians walking around on land, then you can make a hypothesis, you can make a prediction. You can say, well, I think if we go to rocks that are 375 million years old, and if they were laid down in fresh water, we might be able to find fossils of the intermediate between the lobe-finned fish and the amphibians that walked around on land. So a group of paleontologists, led by this guy, Neil Shubin, looked for rocks that were 375 million years old, laid down in fresh water, and they found some, and much to their dismay, they were near Greenland, in a place that you don't want to spend your summers. But they went. They went for 5 years. He and a team of researchers went to Ellesmere Island in northern Canada, and 4 years they found nothing, and in the 5th year they discovered precisely what they had expected to find, which was this guy, which is Tiktaalik. It's named, it's the local Eskimo word for fish is what they decided to name it. And Tiktaalik indeed has some characteristics of lobe-finned fish and some characteristics of amphibians with feet. It has appendages that are in between feet and fins. They're right here on this sequence between fin and foot. There's Tiktaalik. It also has a neck, which fish don't have. There are many characteristics that show that it's an intermediate fossil between lobe-finned fish and amphibians that walked around. It also has gills and lungs, which is probably pretty handy, and made it pretty happy. This is just one example of thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of what scientists do when they go and look for transitional fossils. So if you're arguing with somebody about this, if you're on the internet, say, arguing about it, and somebody says, well, there's no transitional fossils. No, there's lots of transitional fossils. But if the only books that you read and the only books that you quote from are from 1920 or 1930 or 1879, you're not going to know about them. Always beware of any book that only quotes from works that are 50 or more years old about science. That's a dead giveaway. Common descent. There are so many techniques to confirm common descent. One of the simplest and most basic is that most of the basic chemicals of life are common to all species. DNA, the bases that code the information in DNA, are the same 4 chemicals in all forms of life. Me and yeast use the same 4 chemicals to code. This proves that life began only once because there's a lot of different chemicals that you could use to do this. There are other chemicals that will do the job, over 100, but me and yeast and starfish, we all use the same chemicals to do this, which is kind of unfortunate, because if I didn't have the same chemicals as everything else, then I would be immune to all of their viruses, and it would be much more difficult for viruses to develop that would infect me. So that's too bad, but that's the way it works. I'm in common descent with all of these different creatures. The same genes for basic life processes are found everywhere. Yeast, sea cucumbers, starfish, and people all use some of the same genes to make the same proteins, even though there are other ways to do it. There are sometimes thousands of ways to do the same chemical action, but so many creatures on Earth do it the same way. Well, what's a better explanation of that? Special creation of each animal with nothing being related, or that everybody's related? Shared genes. We share genes in common. For instance, I as a human, I share about 98% of my genes with chimpanzees, about 85% with zebrafish, 36% with the fruit fly, only 25% with the roundworm, which proves my wife wrong. I am not, in fact, a worm. 15% with mustard grass, and only 7% on average with most bacteria. What's the best explanation of this? Common descent. So let's talk about the biggie that really offends people, human and chimpanzees. By the way, it's not a scientific, it's not part of the theory of evolution that humans are descended from chimpanzees. No, the theory is that we have a common ancestor with the chimpanzee, not that we are descended from the chimpanzee, that before there was an animal in common that gave rise to both humans and chimpanzees. So these are the chromosomes. Chromosomes are the tightly packed little bundles of genetic material. You've probably seen them before. And of course, very, very similar between humans and chimpanzees. Where humans have 1 chromosome, here chimpanzees have 2. So someone says, aha, we're not related to chimpanzee. Oh, sorry. That one chromosome human is actually the 2 chimpanzee chromosomes stuck together in an evolutionary process called chromosomal fusion. If we were not related to chimpanzees, if we didn't share a common ancestor, this would not be true. These are things that Darwin didn't know. This is the flowering, the opening up of Darwin's initial insight, and the proof of it through all of this work by so many people working for so long. And again, not to pile on, but what is a better explanation of this similarity between the genetic material of human beings and chimpanzees, that there's no relation between us at all, or that in fact we share a common ancestor. And as Catholics, we can answer that honestly. We don't have to hold anything in the back of our minds, because the popes have said, this is fine. This doesn't, no problem for your faith. You just have to understand that you have a soul and the chimpanzee doesn't. So we can answer it honestly and say, well, yeah, it's obvious. There are so many other tests for common descent, so many other proofs of it. Geographical distribution of species. When Darwin was sailing around South America, one of the things that he noticed is when he went to the islands around South America, there were unique species on the islands, but that they were very similar to the species that were on the mainland. And so this is one of the things that tipped him off to biological evolution. What's the best explanation for these species on the islands? Like the finches, if you roll all the way back to our first slide, all those finches with the different beaks, well, they were obviously related to the finches on the mainland of South America, but they were different. And so he developed his theory, well, this was a colonization event, that finches made it out to the island, but they were isolated out on the island where they evolved along their own lines. Vestigial organs. This is a good one. So a good example of vestigial organs are eyes on cave-dwelling animals. You've probably seen pictures of cave-dwelling animals, crickets and salamanders and moles and all sorts of things. There are changes that occur to animals when they live in complete darkness. One thing that typically happens to species is their eyes don't work anymore. They have eyes, but they're non-functional. The explanation from Darwin's theory would be that along the way, a mutation that caused the animal to go blind happened, but there was no particular problem with it. If you live in the dark, it's no disadvantage not to have eyes that work. So you have, after a great amount of time, species whose eyes are present but they don't work. What's a better explanation for an animal with eyes that don't work? Is it Paley's explanation of the watchmaker, which says that every animal is perfectly designed to do its job and all parts of it are perfect, or common descent? Well, eyes that don't work are not a perfection. That's not a reflection of a perfect design. It's a reflection of something that changed over time. There are lots of other vestigial organs and vestigial things in the animal kingdom. It's really important. This comes up in debate all the time. When you see a vestigial organ, this is something that it may not be useless. It's just not used for its obvious primary purpose. I'm sure ostriches enjoy having their wings. They can flap them to keep cool. But there's certainly no use for flight. That makes them vestigial. Just because they're not useless doesn't mean they're not vestigial. Okay, so here's a good one. Endogenous retroviruses. I'll try to get through this. I hope you biologists in the room don't laugh at me. So we've all probably had viruses and been infected by viruses. And if you catch a virus, there are going to be one of two outcomes. Either you'll die from it, or you'll recover from it. But either way, it doesn't have a permanent effect on you. But occasionally, a virus will infect egg or sperm cells. And if a virus infects an egg or a sperm cell and changes the genetic code, that's what a virus does. It hijacks your cell, changes the genetic code to make your cell make copies of itself. If a virus infects an egg or a sperm cell, and that egg or sperm cell goes on to fertilize and produce a new generation, then that viral DNA will now be passed on to the next generation. This is one of the ways that the DNA code in species can change. Humans in our genetic code have about 30,000 of these little viral packets of DNA in our cells that reflect all the times this has happened, all the way back in our evolutionary history. And now, since the human genome has been sequenced, and we've sequenced the genomes of many other animals, we can now look and say, of these little viruses that are this history of being infected for all these millions of years, how many of them do we share with different species? We share the most of these little endogenous viruses in our DNA with the chimpanzees and the orangutans. We share fewer of them with other mammals like mice and cats and different things. We share fewer with reptiles, but we can see these chains of commonality here. It perfectly fits the model of common descent. Other thing to bring up is most people are familiar with genetic technology because we've seen it on Law and Order on TV. You get the the witness on the stand and somebody says, but we have your DNA. And we've all heard that on cop shows. We got the DNA. Well, what particularly is it? Why are the cops going to get the DNA? And why does the CSI team get the DNA? Well, because there are variations in our genetic code which are unique to our family tree. Even within humanity, we can use DNA to determine what family tree someone is from, what their relationship to another person is. If you were on a jury, and if the guy from the police department crime lab said, well, we found DNA at the crime scene, we tested the DNA, and there's a 99.8% chance that it comes from that guy, would you vote to convict? I think most people would. That same technology is used in science to verify common descent. There are many, many ways that it's used. But this level of certainty is the level of certainty we can have about common descent based on all the work that's been done by hundreds of thousands and millions of people verifying this theory over the last 150 years. And if we remember, as Catholics, John Paul said, the convergence, neither sought nor fabricated. What would it mean, sought or fabricated? That would mean if it was a put-up job, if it was a conspiracy. The convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, of the results of work that was conducted independently is itself a significant argument in favor of this theory. Well, this is some of that independent work, all of these different ways that common descent has been proven. Now, the other common objection that you hear to Darwinism, and it comes up again and again and again and again and again, is, well, we've never seen a species being created. We've never seen a speciation event. We've never seen one species change to another species. We've never seen, and you get some of these silly things, well, I've never seen a dog give birth to a cat. A dog always gives birth to a dog. Again, if you want to be correct on this, you've got to keep up with the science. Yes, we have observed many, many, many speciation events. We've observed many new species coming into being. We'll talk about just a few of them. All of this you can research. If you're interested, go and research this. It's everywhere. There's good books. This is a really excellent book by Jerry Coyne, professor at the University of Chicago, called Why Evolution is True. It's got most of this information in it. It's fantastic. He presents it much better than I can. So, there's a particular fruit fly called an apple maggot fly. Apple maggot flies, they tend to come back to the same kind of apple that they ate as a maggot worm. They tend to come back to that same kind of apple as an adult to mate and lay their eggs. So when a new species of apple is developed and planted and introduced, the maggot flies that eat one kind of apple as a worm tend to come back to that kind of apple as an adult to mate and lay eggs. And over time, they quit interbreeding. They become separate populations. When they become separate populations of flies, naturally occurring variations in their genetics render them eventually unable to interbreed. This is a speciation event. Flies have a very short life cycle. That's one of the reasons fruit flies are used in laboratories for doing genetic experiments, is because it's really, really fast. A generation goes by really quickly in a fruit fly. So we can observe speciation events caused by what human beings do with apple trees. The Madeira Island mice. Madeira is an island off the coast of Portugal. It was settled about 500 years ago when the Portuguese sailed out to it. And the Portuguese, like everywhere the Portuguese and Spaniards and everybody went on their sailing ships, the Portuguese had stowaways. They had European brown mice went along. And so mice were introduced on the island of Madeira off the coast of Portugal. So they've been there, and we know exactly how long they've been there, and we can compare the mice to the mice on the mainland. The mice on the island of Madeira have speciated several times. There are now 5 or 6 separate species of mice on the island of Madeira. That chromosomal fusion, like this, that happened between humans and chimpanzees, mice do that a lot. That process is creating new species of mice. In 500 years, we've got about 5, perhaps 6 species of mice on the island of Madeira. That's a good one. Here's a really neat one. I like this one. It's called a ring species. All right, so this is the greenish warbler, little bird. Greenish warbler apparently developed down here in northern India, and then it moved north. And as it moved north, it had to go around something. Does anybody know what it is that it's going around? The Himalayas, right. The poor little greenish bird can't fly over the Himalayas. So as it moves north, it's split by the Himalayas. Now, the greenish warbler There are different colors and different varieties within the species, but they can all interbreed. All around here, all of these birds interbreed. But then at the end of this split, this ring, it comes back together and they meet again in Siberia. And those birds are more distantly related than anywhere else on this ring of the ring species. And at the upper end of the ring, they're not able to interbreed anymore. They sing different songs, they're looking for different things in mates, and if you do try to hybridize them, they produce sterile young. This is a speciation event that's occurring. These rings are present everywhere. There's a really good one concerning the gulls, the seagulls, around the North Pole. If you go to Scotland, they were originally described as two different gulls, a black gull and a white gull. But recently, we figured out that it's actually one species that propagated around the North Pole. And when it comes all the way back around to the beginning, it no longer interbreeds frequently. Now they're described as separate species. But if you take these gulls, they can interbreed all the way around the North Pole. It's only back at the beginning where they're different enough that they don't interbreed frequently. So this is a ring species. It's a description. There's one more. There's a particular salamander in California that it's separated by the Central Valley of California, which is very dry, but it exists on both the coast and in the mountains where Yosemite Park is. And so it starts at the north, and it can all interbreed all the way down both sides. When you get to the bottom of the Central Valley in South California, they no longer can interbreed very effectively down there. They're speciating. Okay, here's my favorite one. This is behavioral speciation. Are these the same bird? So if you ask a bird watcher and you say, how about an eastern western meadowlark? They know, ooh, that's a tough one. So, commonsensically, are these birds related? Yes. Are these the same kind of bird? All right, talk about that. So the eastern and western meadowlark were apparently one species that ranged all across North America, and something separated them into two groups. What's a good idea of what it might have been? Well, during the last ice age, the Rocky Mountains were a giant sheet of ice that may have encouraged the meadowlarks not to fly over the Rocky Mountains covered in ice. That may have been what separated the species. They were separated for a period of time. The ice melted. And now they overlap. In fact, we're very close. They overlap in our part of the country. They overlap particularly in Arkansas. And bird watchers in the central United States, they see these two birds, and in order to determine which species they're looking at, they have to listen to them. First, the western. One more time. That's the western. That's the one on the left. Now we'll go to the eastern. Tell the difference? Here's the problem. So can the meadowlarks. These species, they were isolated long enough that they changed. They not only changed genetically due to natural processes, but they also started singing different songs. Bird song is not genetic. Young birds actually learn how to sing the song from the adult birds around them, and that's not a perfect process. Again, it's information that can become a little bit corrupted. So while these birds were separated, they started to sing slightly different songs. Over time, since they were no longer interacting, the songs diverged. Now they've come back together and they overlap, but they're not listening to each other anymore. Now, when the male sings that song, if it's a western meadowlark, only a western meadowlark female recognizes that song as being a mating call, and same for the eastern. And so now, in laboratory conditions, if you encourage them to mate, they don't produce fertile offspring anymore. Now they're described as two separate species. This is a speciation event. So we've never seen a species being created? Bull. Okay. Now, my absolute favorite. One of the problems with this, when somebody says, I don't believe in Darwinism, we've never seen a species being created, is this entire concept of species is a human construct. It comes mainly from our idea, in the first place, that all animals were specially created according to their kind, is what it says in Genesis. So, commonsensically, what are these? Two different bears? I think everybody knows what these are. We've got a polar bear and a grizzly bear, right? These are two different kinds of bears. If you go to the zoo, they're in two different cages. Why? They live in two different biomes. They live two different lifestyles. They look different. They have different forms, shapes, colors, all these different things. Commonsensically, these are two different species that produce according to their kind, right? Meet the Pizzly bear. The Pizzly bear is a hybrid of the polar bear and the grizzly bear. This was a sort of a legendary thing for a long time. People weren't sure what they were looking at before genetic technology. They'd say, well, we saw a bear. Maybe it was an albino grizzly bear. They would see things like this. But in 2006, one was shot, and for the first time, it was subjected to genetic analysis, and it was determined absolutely that it was a hybrid between the polar bear and the grizzly bear. And that told us something. That told us that these two animals can interbreed. They're more related than we thought they were. Now, in 2010, this is why you got to keep up with the science. Science is ongoing. In 2010, another Pizzly bear was shot. This one was subjected to genetic analysis and determined that it was a second-generation Pizzly bear, meaning that the Pizzly bears are fertile. They're not sterile hybrids. They're fertile cubs. So now, what is this? Are these two kinds of animals, or is this one kind of animal with two variations? See, when you say, I've never seen a species being created, well, I have. There is one. But it depends very much how you define what a species is. You will also hear an objection to Darwinism. Someone will say, well, I believe that there's variation within species. I believe there's microevolution, that a species can change, but I don't believe that one species can change into another. What we should be seeing from these examples, it's the same thing. It's the same thing, just propagated over time and space. There's no such thing as micro and macro evolution. There's change. There's genetic change, and we can see it operating. And this is how life works. And the church says, yes, this is how life works. This is what we've discovered. This is what the scientific endeavor has shown. It's truth. Therefore, it doesn't contradict any other truth. There's no problem for us. So, as Catholics, we have no problems with this. We have no particular issue with any of this unless it starts to talk about the soul, unless it starts to talk about our place in the universe relative to God. Then we have to apply our faculties of reasoning to it and say, is it consistent with our Catholic faith? Does that make sense? Okay. And we actually finished a little bit early. We're done.